A racist police officer shaves a black boy's head in court, unaware his father is a high-ranking official. What happens next will leave you speechless. 12-year-old Amir Daniels sat in the courtroom, a small figure among the towering adults, his hands folded tightly in his lap. His legs, too short for the long wooden bench, dangled off the edge, tapping nervously against the floor. He had never imagined being here, in this sterile room with its gray walls and wooden paneling, surrounded by faces he didn't recognize. He'd imagined school problems, of course, homework, teasing, maybe even a fight or two. But this was a different kind of battle, one he had never been prepared for. Amir's crime, as it had been labeled by the authorities, was defending himself. A simple shove from another student who had taunted him in the hallway. But somehow, everything had spiraled out of control. The shove had triggered something much larger, and now, Amir found himself in the middle of a juvenile hearing. His name dragged through the mud in the local papers as if he were a criminal. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet here he was, the accused. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, the whispers of onlookers mixing with the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Amir's eyes stayed fixed on the polished surface of the desk in front of him, avoiding the gaze of the people around him. His head felt heavy, not because of the weight of the situation, but because of the strange sensation of being different. He couldn't stop the thought from swirling in his mind. Why was he here? Why was this happening to him? Amir had always been proud of his hair. Thick and curly, it was something his late mother used to lovingly braid every week. It was a piece of her that he carried with him, his connection to her, even after she had passed away. That hair, in its wild, unkempt beauty, had always made Amir feel like he had a part of his mother with him. But that had all changed just hours ago in a holding room, where Officer Grayson, a white cop with a well-known reputation for overstepping his authority, had made a move that sent shockwaves through Amir's heart. Grayson's punishment had been swift and cruel. Disciplinary grooming, he had called it, as though his words were justified. But Amir knew better. It was a humiliation, an attempt to strip away something that made him feel whole. As the officer's clippers buzzed relentlessly through his thick curls, Amir had closed his eyes, clenching his jaw. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. He simply endured. Every snip felt like a piece of his dignity was being taken from him, every strand of hair that fell to the ground like a part of his identity unraveling before his very eyes. Now, as he sat in the courtroom, Amir felt every eye on him, but he didn't look up. The silence was suffocating, the stares sharp and judgmental. People looked at him, some confused, others disapproving, but none of them understanding. The whispers started, low at first, and then louder as the murmurs spread across the room. His mother's braids were gone, his proud crown of curls gone. He was bald, vulnerable, exposed, a boy who had been stripped of more than just his hair. The judge, Perkins, paused mid-sentence, his eyes flicking briefly to Amir. There was a flicker of something there, an acknowledgement that something was wrong, something that didn't fit the usual script of juvenile hearings. But Amir could tell that Judge Perkins didn't know the whole story. The officer standing near the bench, arms crossed smugly, wasn't just any cop. He was Officer Grayson, the man who had made sure Amir would carry this humiliation with him for the rest of his life. Grayson didn't look at Amir with shame or regret. No, he stood there, still proud, still sure that what he had done was justified. But what he didn't know, what no one in that courtroom knew, was that Amir's father was alive, and he was watching from the back of the room. Amir didn't know it yet, but his life was about to change forever. His father, Major Terrence Daniels, had been listed as MIA for 3 long years. The army had declared him dead, and Amir had learned to live without him. He had grieved, tried to move on, and made peace with the fact that his father was gone. But the letter that had arrived weeks ago, with no return address and no sender's name, had changed everything. "I never left you. I'm watching. Be strong." The words had echoed in Amir's mind ever since. Be strong. And that's what he had tried to do, stay strong despite everything. What Amir didn't know, and what no one else in the room could possibly guess, was that his father, the man thought to be dead, was now in the courtroom, hidden from view but very much alive. Terrence had been working undercover in a special military operation tied to international corruption. His mission had been so secretive, so dangerous, that he had been forced to sever all ties with his family. For years, he had stayed silent, watching from the shadows. But when the news of Amir's arrest and the horrific head-shaving reached him, Terrence made a choice. He broke protocol. The operation was still active, but his son's suffering took precedence. He couldn't stay away anymore. In the back of the courtroom, hidden beneath a cap and a plain jacket, Terrence sat, his eyes never leaving Amir. He studied every detail, the nervous shifting, the way Amir's hands gripped his lap, the way the boy seemed to shrink into himself, trying to avoid the looks of the people around him. It was painful for Terrence, more than he could put into words. Amir, his son, had been humiliated. And the worst part? Amir had accepted it. He hadn't fought back. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't even cried. He had simply endured like he thought he deserved this. Terrence clenched his jaw, his heart breaking for the son he had never wanted to leave. But he would make it right. He couldn't stay silent anymore. He wouldn't. Terrence's eyes narrowed as Grayson, oblivious to the storm brewing behind him, continued to stand proudly by the bench. The officer had no idea that the man who had once led covert missions, the man who was feared and respected in the darkest corners of the world, was sitting just behind him. And Grayson had no idea that his actions, his cruelty toward Amir, were about to be exposed in a way he could never have imagined. As the hearing continued, the tension in the courtroom thickened. It was clear that something wasn't right. The prosecution had barely mentioned the head shaving. The defense had done nothing to challenge the authority of Officer Grayson. But Amir had already been judged, by everyone but the one person who truly mattered, his father. Grayson didn't know it yet, but his reign of intimidation was about to come to an end. And Amir, despite everything that had been done to him, was no longer alone. The sound of the gavel striking the desk echoed through the room. "Next case," the judge said, his voice carrying across the room like a dismissive afterthought. But as he moved to call the next case, the door to the courtroom opened. And the man who had been silent for 3 years, Major Terrence Daniels, stood up from the back, his voice cutting through the murmur of the room like a blade. "Your Honor," he said, his tone calm and controlled, "I request to be heard as a witness." Grayson's smug expression faltered. His eyes widened as he turned toward the back of the room. There, standing tall and unwavering, was the man whose name he knew all too well. Terrence Daniels, the Phantom, the soldier who had vanished from the face of the earth. The man whose presence in this courtroom would change everything. Amir Daniels had sat silently in the courtroom for nearly an hour now, his hands tightly clenched in his lap, his gaze fixed downward at his now bare scalp. He had always worn his thick, curly hair with pride, remembering how his mother used to braid it with care each week. But now the loss of it felt like more than just a physical transformation. It felt like a humiliation he would never erase. The buzzing of whispers from the crowd, the muffled sounds of shoes scraping across the floor, and the shifting of seats in the uncomfortable silence, all seemed distant to him. His mind was elsewhere, swirling with emotions he didn't quite know how to process. The evidence against him was thin, yet Grayson's words had carried weight. Aggressive, disrespectful, and hostile. He heard them over and over, even though none of those words had ever described him before. But what stung most was the certainty that Amir was alone in all of this. His father was gone, presumed dead for 3 long years, and even in the absence of his guidance, Amir had never once doubted his place in the world. Until now. He had always tried to stay strong, to live up to the quiet dignity his father had taught him to uphold, but sitting here now, in the harsh glare of the courtroom lights, his sense of worth had started to crumble. Behind the cold metal bars of the witness stand, Grayson continued to speak, his voice unwavering as he painted Amir in the darkest possible light. Amir wanted to shout, to tell the room that he hadn't started this, that it was the officer who had shoved him first, but the words never came. Instead, he stared, eyes glued to his hands, now devoid of their proud curls. It was in that moment, as the courtroom listened to Grayson speak with increasing venom, that a chill suddenly swept through Amir's chest. His breath caught in his throat as he felt something, no, someone, shift in the air behind him. A familiar sensation gnawed at his thoughts, the sensation that he wasn't alone. He turned his head slightly, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw a figure standing in the back row, just beyond the sea of unfamiliar faces. A man dressed in a dark coat, a baseball cap tilted low, obscuring his face. Amir couldn't explain it, but something about that man felt right. There was a strange gravity to him, something unspoken, an invisible force that seemed to pull Amir's attention toward him. For a moment, he thought it was just his exhaustion playing tricks on him. But no, this wasn't a trick. It was a presence he couldn't ignore. His mind raced, and for a split second, he wondered if it was just wishful thinking. But deep down, he knew. He knew that man was someone he hadn't seen in 3 years. Someone he had almost given up on. Terrence Daniels, his father. The man had been listed as missing in action during an overseas military operation. His status presumed dead. The government had sent letters of condolences, and life had moved on without him. Amir had buried the hope that he would ever return. And though he had once believed that his father was invincible, time had worn away the edges of that belief. But now, here was a figure standing before him. The mere shape of him enough to stir something deep within Amir's chest. A mixture of disbelief, hope, and dread. The sound of Grayson's voice faded into the background, as if the world itself was dimming, and Amir's eyes remained locked on the figure, who had yet to move or acknowledge anyone else in the room. Was it truly him? Was it really his father, back from the dead? Amir couldn't breathe. His body stiffened, the weight of the moment settling in his bones like a leaden weight. The courtroom felt smaller, the air heavier. His mind raced back to the letter that had arrived only days ago, the one with no return address. He had read it over and over in disbelief. I never left you. I'm watching. Be strong. The words, so simple, yet filled with such weight, had lingered with him. He had hoped, no, he had desperately wished, that it meant something more. But now, the truth was standing in front of him. Terrence Daniels was alive. He had been watching all along. Amir's chest tightened as emotions surged within him. Anger, confusion, and joy all blended into one overwhelming wave. He wanted to cry out, to run toward his father, but something in the air held him back. He could feel the presence of the man, but he could not yet understand what had brought him here. For the briefest of moments, he thought about what it would be like to speak to his father again, to ask him everything that had been left unsaid. But even with the presence of Terrence in the room, the questions and fears piled up, suffocating him in a sea of uncertainty. His father remained motionless, his gaze fixed not on Amir, but on Grayson, whose smug arrogance seemed to waver under the weight of Terrence's stare. Amir watched as his father's jaw clenched, the familiar set of his features frozen with resolve. The courtroom fell into a tense silence, broken only by the faint rustling of papers and the sounds of people shifting in their seats. It was as if everyone, for just a moment, was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Finally, the man in the back stood up. The room seemed to hold its breath as Terrence took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving Grayson's. His movements were calculated, deliberate. There was no rush, no sign of panic. He had been trained for moments like this, moments where everything hinged on the perfect balance of timing and restraint. Your Honor, Terrence's voice broke the stillness. It was low, steady, but there was a sharpness to it, like the edge of a blade. I request to be heard as a witness. The words hung in the air, as if everyone had to process them before they could move forward. The room seemed to freeze in place as the weight of what was happening started to sink in. Grayson's face shifted from smugness to a pale, ashen hue, his arms dropping limply by his sides. Terrence's presence in the room was no longer a question of who he was, but a question of what would happen next. And Grayson knew exactly what it meant. The judge, his hands trembling ever so slightly, cleared his throat before speaking, his voice surprisingly calm despite the bombshell that had just been dropped. Mr. Daniels, he said slowly, almost in disbelief, I'm here now, Terence interrupted, his voice unwavering. His eyes never strayed from Grayson's. And I'm here to make sure my son gets the justice he deserves. The courtroom was silent. Time seemed to stretch on, each second filled with the promise of something monumental. And then, with a motion of the judge's hand, it was as if the floodgates had been opened. The tension that had been hanging in the air finally broke, and the room fell into an uncertain anticipation. Something big was about to happen, and everyone could feel it. The courtroom was thick with tension, as if the air itself had thickened in anticipation. Every creak of the wooden benches, every shift in the seats, seemed amplified as the trial proceeded. Amir Daniels sat still, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his gaze fixed straight ahead, his posture rigid. The silence was almost deafening, the weight of the entire room's judgment pressing down on him. His eyes were locked on Officer Grayson, who stood at the front, smug and self-assured, recounting a version of events that felt completely alien to Amir. Grayson's voice echoed through the sterile courtroom, painting Amir as the villain. He was aggressive, hostile, a threat to the other students. Grayson testified, his words steady, his eyes unblinking as he stared at Amir. When I arrived at the school, the boy was defiant. His behavior was disrespectful. He refused to follow my commands, and when I attempted to detain him, he fought back. Grayson paused for effect, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room. I had no choice but to subdue him. Amir didn't flinch. He hadn't said a word since the moment he was brought in, and he wasn't about to speak now. His eyes were dark and distant, as if the very courtroom itself was a world away. He could hear the whispers from the other students, the disapproving glances from the teachers, but it all felt irrelevant. They didn't see him. Not really. They saw what Grayson had told them to see, an angry, violent black kid. The truth was much deeper, but Amir knew, better than anyone, that truth had no place here. The defense attorney, a young public defender who had barely raised his voice above a whisper the entire day, remained silent, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He had yet to challenge anything that Grayson had said. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was lack of preparation, but Amir could see it in his eyes. This man was out of his depth. Amir's heart sank a little at the thought. He had no real defender here. Not yet. The prosecutor, an older man with a face carved from years of hard work in the system, frowned slightly, his eyes flicking toward the judge. Judge Perkins, who had yet to show any real sign of decision-making, looked just as confused as everyone else. Amir's situation was spiraling out of control, but there was still hope. Terence, his father, the man who had disappeared without a trace 3 years ago, the man Amir had thought was gone forever. Grayson finished his testimony, and the silence that followed seemed like a loud, suffocating pressure. Amir remained still, locked in his own thoughts, trying to block out the sting of the accusations. He hadn't fought anyone. Not really. He had only defended himself. But to the people in this room, that didn't matter. And then it happened. The air seemed to shift, and Amir's attention snapped from Grayson to the back of the room. He could feel the sudden presence of someone, a new weight added to the space. The hushed whispers that had filled the room died down. For a moment, the courtroom was too quiet, too still. Amir glanced up, his heart racing in his chest. But it wasn't until the voice rang out that he truly realized what was happening. Your Honor. The voice was calm, firm, but full of authority. It wasn't the voice of a defense attorney or prosecutor. It was the voice of someone who had seen battle, who had stood in the face of adversity and never faltered. Amir's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the name. Mr. Daniels? The judge's voice cracked through the silence as he looked toward the back of the room. There, standing in the shadows of the courtroom, was a man dressed in civilian clothes, his face partially obscured by a cap. But Amir knew. Deep down, he knew. It was his father, Terence Daniels. Grayson's face went pale. His arrogant posture faltered as his eyes locked onto the figure at the back. The man he knew only through his training, through the whispers of his reputation. The phantom, A ghost who had disappeared from the world of black ops and reappeared with no warning, no explanation. A man whose very name had been enough to send chills through the most hardened criminals. Grayson's hands trembled ever so slightly. His past, his mistakes, they were all suddenly crashing down on him. The judge, though clearly caught off guard, was quick to recover. "Mr. Daniels," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "what is it you wish to present?" Terrence stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Grayson's. Every movement was precise, deliberate, a man who had spent years in covert operations, where every step counted and every action was measured. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small flash drive, handing it over to the bailiff. "This," Terrence said, his voice steady and unwavering, "contains footage from the holding cell before Amir's court appearance. It was quietly retrieved by someone who believed in right and wrong more than rank." Amir watched as the flash drive was passed along the aisle. The courtroom had gone completely still. The judge nodded to the bailiff, who swiftly inserted the drive into the court's computer. The screen flickered to life, casting a blue light across the room. The first video began to play. The footage was grainy, but the image was clear enough. Amir saw himself, sitting in a chair, the bright fluorescent lights above casting sharp shadows across his face. And then Grayson appeared. He towered over Amir, his expression a mixture of disdain and superiority. The video captured the moment Grayson had forced Amir's head into his hands and started cutting his hair. Amir could see himself flinch at the first touch of the razor, his eyes pleading as he quietly whispered, "My mom used to braid it, please don't." The video continued, showing Grayson mockingly running the blade through Amir's hair, making cruel jokes as the boy sat silently, enduring the humiliation. The room gasped. Some jurors had to cover their mouths in shock, while others looked toward Grayson, their eyes wide with disbelief. The judge's face reddened with fury, his fists clenched on the desk. Grayson's arrogant smirk melted away, replaced by a look of fear. "Why did you do that, Officer Grayson?" Terrence's voice cut through the air like a blade. "He didn't raise it, didn't need to. It was enough." Grayson's eyes flicked nervously, his hands shaking as if trying to control the tremors that were threatening to betray him. The next video clip started. This one was from a body camera, an angle Amir had never seen. It showed the earlier altercation at school, the one Grayson had described as Amir being the aggressor. Amir saw himself clearly now, his hands raised in defense, no violence, no hostility. The boy had merely reacted to being shoved, trying to create space between him and the other student. The footage spoke for itself. Amir had been defending himself. The courtroom erupted into chaos. The judge slammed his gavel, but no one was listening anymore. Grayson stood there utterly exposed. His actions, his lies, had been uncovered in the most humiliating way possible. He looked broken, a shell of the man he had been just moments before. His arrogance was gone, replaced by fear, by realization. The truth had finally come out, and there was no escaping it. Terrence turned to the judge. "You punished my son for being proud of who he is. You humiliated him for something you didn't understand," he said, his voice still calm, but filled with an undeniable strength. "And now you're going to answer for it." Grayson's face crumpled as he dropped his gaze to the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The weight of his actions had finally caught up with him. And Amir just sat there, silent, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment he had been waiting for. This was the moment where his life, his truth, was finally being heard. The courtroom was deathly quiet, a tension so thick it felt like the air had turned to steel. Every breath felt forced, every heartbeat felt louder. All eyes were on Terrence Daniels as he stepped forward, a flash drive held tightly in his hand. The atmosphere hummed with anticipation, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the truth to be revealed. Terrence's gaze never wavered from the judge, his expression calm but resolute. He didn't need to say anything yet. The weight of his presence spoke for him. He handed the flash drive to the bailiff without looking, his fingers brushing against the smooth surface as if handling something far more dangerous than mere plastic. His eyes flicked over to Amir, still sitting at the defendant's table, his eyes wide but unreadable. Amir didn't know what his father was about to reveal, but Terence knew that this moment, this reckoning, would change everything. The bailiff took the drive and walked briskly to the judge's bench. He inserted the device into the courtroom's computer, and a moment later, the screen behind the judge flickered to life. The room fell into an eerie silence as the video began to play. It started innocuously enough. A small, dimly lit room, the kind of holding cell that most people wouldn't think twice about. But then, the camera zoomed in, and the image of Amir came into view. His hands were cuffed, his posture slumped. His thick, curly hair, once a crown of pride, now sat untouched, untamed. And then the figure of Officer Grayson entered the frame, walking with the kind of confident swagger only an officer with years of unchallenged power could possess. His hands were gloved, and his expression was one of disdain, grinning as if he knew exactly what he was about to do. Grayson's voice was gruff as he addressed Amir. "You think this is a game, kid? You want to be tough in front of your friends? Well, I'll show you what real discipline is." He grabbed a clump of Amir's hair, yanking it forward. Amir's face, though filled with shock, remained eerily calm. The boy's mouth moved, but no words came out. The quiet plea, "My mom used to braid it. Please don't," echoed through the room, soft and pleading. The camera caught Grayson's cruel laugh as he snipped at Amir's hair, disregarding the boy's plea, ignoring his humanity. The sound of scissors cutting through thick strands of hair filled the room, mingling with the soft sobs of Amir's breath. The jurors sat frozen, eyes wide, horrified by the abuse that unfolded on screen. A few gasped, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One woman covered her mouth with both hands, and the judge's knuckles whitened on his gavel. The video continued, showing Grayson pushing Amir's head down with a smirk on his face, as if enjoying the humiliation of the young boy before him. It was a brutal act, one meant not to discipline but to break. The room had fallen into stunned silence as the camera captured the final moments of the video. Grayson, turning Amir's head so the camera could see the aftermath, his hair reduced to uneven stubble, a symbol of shattered pride. Grayson, with a satisfied grin, left the room, locking the door behind him. The judge's voice broke through the silence, his tone shaky with anger. This is appalling. How could anyone?" Terence cut him off, his voice calm but seething with restraint. "And now, Your Honor, let me show you something else." He nodded at the bailiff to switch the footage. The screen flickered again, this time showing body cam footage. The scene was set outside at the schoolyard. Amir, his back to the camera, was shown walking toward the other students. A boy, older and taller, shoved Amir roughly. It was a minor altercation, something that should have been handled by a teacher or school official. But the camera caught the key moment. Amir, in response, raised his hands not in aggression but in self-defense. He wasn't attacking, he was reacting. The footage showed Amir's calm expression, his hands lifted in the universal gesture of peace. It was clear from the footage that Amir hadn't fought back. He wasn't the instigator. He had only defended himself. The room was quiet as the camera showed the exact moment when the violence escalated, not because of Amir, but because of the boy's push, the tension in the air. The narrative, the lies, all of it began to collapse in front of them. Terence's voice broke the stillness once more, steady and filled with purpose. "You punished my son for being proud of who he is. You humiliated him for something you didn't understand. For what? To send a message? To break him?" He turned his steely gaze toward Grayson, who, for the first time, looked less like the powerful officer and more like a man on trial. His hands trembled slightly, his once confident posture faltering. "You thought you could break him?" Terence continued, his voice calm yet filled with a restrained fury. "But all you did was show the world who you really are." Grayson's face paled, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. He was no longer the man in control. His confidence was slipping, replaced by a deep, gnawing dread. His arrogance was gone, replaced by something worse, fear. The judge shifted uneasily in his seat, his gavel tapping once against the surface. "I believe that will be all for now," he said, his voice heavy with distaste. Terrence's eyes remained locked on Grayson. He wasn't finished. "Not yet. I have one more thing to say." He paused for a beat, his jaw tightening. "But this isn't just about one cop. This is about the system that protected him. This is about the people who let this happen. And I'm going to make sure that everyone involved knows that I'll be the one to expose it." The judge's eyes widened. Grayson's face crumpled even further. He knew the game was over. Terrence wasn't just here for justice. This was something deeper, something more urgent. He had a mission that had started with Amir but would not end here. As the courtroom filled with murmurs and whispers, Terrence turned to Amir, whose face was still blank but now glistening with unshed tears. The boy didn't speak, but his eyes told Terrence everything he needed to know. The man who had been silent for years, who had fought battles across the globe without a word, had found his voice. And it was now roaring in this courtroom. Terrence's mission wasn't over. It had only just begun. The gavel fell, a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom, signaling a break in the tension. Judge Perkins, his face ashen, motioned for a recess. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor mixed with the rapid clicking of reporters' pens, eager to capture every moment of the scandal. Officer Grayson, still stiff and defensive, was escorted out of the courtroom by 2 officers. But they didn't cuff him. Yet. It was a small detail, but it didn't escape the crowd's notice. Grayson's arrogance hadn't fully cracked. He still held himself like a man with power. The courtroom, once filled with the murmurs of accusation and disbelief, now buzzed like a shaken beehive. People were everywhere, talking, speculating, and looking at Amir, who sat motionless beside his father. Terrence didn't speak. He simply sat down beside his son, careful to avoid any sudden movements. For the first time in 3 years, he was here, sitting next to Amir in a place where he should have been all along. The boy looked up at him, his expression a mixture of disbelief and quiet awe. His eyes were still wide from the shock of his father's sudden appearance. Amir hadn't seen him since he was a small child. In his memory, his father had been a shadow, a story told by others, a face seen only in photographs. "You came back," Amir whispered, his voice thin with emotion. He didn't want to ask, didn't want to allow himself the vulnerability, but it escaped him in a rush. Terrence could feel the weight of his son's gaze. The question hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Terrence could only stare back. His mind wasn't fully there yet, it was still processing everything. The way Grayson had treated Amir, the complete disregard for the boy's dignity, it hit him harder than he cared to admit. But he couldn't afford to break. He couldn't allow the flood of emotions to overtake him. Not now. Not when the war wasn't over. "I never left you," Terrence replied softly, his voice steady. He placed a hand gently on Amir's shoulder. It was the most intimate contact he had had with his son in years. "I was just locked in a longer fight." Amir didn't cry. He didn't lash out. He just leaned into his father, his head bowed in silent acknowledgement. But his face was conflicted, his thoughts torn between relief and confusion. They hadn't spoken in years, and now here was his father, right next to him, in the midst of all this chaos. What did it mean? What did it change? Terrence could feel his son's uncertainty, but he knew that wasn't the problem. It wasn't the doubt in Amir's mind that terrified him. It was the system they were up against. The men and women behind Grayson, the ones in charge, the ones who would let this abuse continue, would do everything to bury the truth. That was what he was here for, to expose it, to bring it to light. His attention shifted, and his hand tightened slightly on Amir's shoulder, a subtle signal that he was still watching, still calculating. His sharp eyes flicked toward the digital screen displaying the timestamp of the video footage. It was small, but something about the numbers didn't sit right with him. He studied them longer, every second stretching out like an eternity. The timestamp didn't match the court logs. The footage had been altered. A faint stirring of tension shifted in his chest, a quiet recognition of what this meant. Grayson hadn't acted alone. This wasn't just a rogue officer's wrongdoing. Someone in this very building had tampered with the evidence, someone higher up. Someone who thought they could erase the proof of what had happened. Terence leaned closer to Amir, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Something's wrong," he murmured. "They're hiding something." Amir looked up at him, still processing everything. His brow furrowed, trying to make sense of the words. But before he could ask, Terence was already standing. "I'm going to handle this," he said, his voice low but resolute. Amir didn't speak. He couldn't. Not when everything was spinning so fast. He just watched as his father made his way to the back of the room, his sharp military movements cutting through the murmur of the crowd. Terence was already piecing it together, just like the old days, when he used to find the smallest discrepancies and unravel the most complicated lies. It wasn't just about one officer anymore. It was about the system that shielded him. It was about the men and women who believed they were untouchable. Terence's eyes narrowed. He had seen this before, this pattern of deception, this careful orchestration of lies. He had been deep in the field, working covert ops that took years to unravel, fighting a war that never truly ended. And now, it seemed, the battlefield had shifted to a courtroom. He pulled out his phone, tapping out a series of quick messages to his contacts, military intelligence officers, tech experts, anyone he could trust. Time was running out. The evidence that Grayson had tried to destroy wasn't the only thing that needed to be uncovered. There was a web of corruption that ran deep, deeper than any of them had realized. In the hallway, he spotted the first crack. A low-level clerk was talking with an officer in hushed tones. Terence didn't have to hear the words to know that something was being covered up. He made a mental note of it, then moved forward with a renewed sense of purpose. His son had already suffered enough. Now it was his turn to carry the burden of justice. Back in the courtroom, the tension mounted. Grayson had been escorted out, but he was still a threat, lurking in the shadows. Terence knew that for every piece of evidence he uncovered, there were a dozen more waiting to be hidden. He had to act quickly, before the entire case was swept under the rug. He had to find out who was really behind this. Someone had orchestrated this from the top. Someone who had known the truth would be uncovered, but who thought they could control the narrative. As Terence moved back toward the bench, his mind was already racing through the possibilities. The floor underfoot felt cold, too cold for a courthouse, too cold for something so personal. He had just stepped into a bigger fight, but this time he wasn't going to let anyone stop him. Grayson's arrogance, the evidence being manipulated, it all pointed to something bigger. This wasn't just a father's mission anymore. It was about righting an entire system that had gotten too comfortable hiding its secrets. Terence leaned over to the judge's bench, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're not done here. Not by a long shot." The judge nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting the same quiet determination. "Then let's make sure we see this through." The courtroom fell silent, but the storm outside was only just beginning. Terence Daniels sat in the dimly lit hotel room, the soft hum of a fan barely cutting through the silence. His eyes were fixed on the screen in front of him, every click of the mouse echoing in the room as he scrolled through pages of digital court records. The air felt heavy with the weight of his actions, the pressure mounting in his chest. The night had already stretched into early morning, but Terence didn't care. This was his fight, and it wasn't just about getting a mere justice. It was about taking down the system that had let this corruption thrive for so long. His fingers trembled slightly as he tapped on the keyboard, his mind sharp despite the exhaustion tugging at his body. Years of covert operations had taught him how to work under pressure, how to extract vital information in moments of chaos. This, however, was different. This wasn't a mission in a far-off country or a matter of global politics. This was personal. This was his son. The firewalls had been tricky, but with the help of some old contacts, tech experts, former military intel officers, he'd managed to break through the layers of security. What had seemed like an insurmountable task now felt within reach. Terence's screen flashed, and he paused. He'd found it. A file labeled Disciplinary Overrides had appeared among the court's digital logs, buried deep within a secure section that only those with high-level access could view. His heart raced as he clicked on it. Inside were a series of audio files, conversations from people who thought they were speaking in secrecy. The first one made Terrence's blood run cold. The voices of Officer Grayson and Assistant District Attorney Nolan were unmistakable. They were discussing ways to send a message to children like Amir, to remind them who had power and control. The conversation was casual, as if the abuse was just another tactic, another way to maintain dominance. "Keep kids like him in line," Grayson had said. "He needs to learn that there are consequences." Nolan had responded, his tone cold and calculating. "This is bigger than him. We have to show them what happens when they step out of line." Terrence felt the anger building in his chest, each word from the recording fueling the fire. His son had been treated like an object, a symbol of everything wrong with a system that thrived on oppression. "Amir wasn't a message," he muttered under his breath. "He's a child." The words stung, a painful reminder of what had been done to his son. He couldn't just let this slide. He wouldn't. The next morning, Terrence arrived at the courthouse early, dressed in a simple suit that barely concealed the quiet fury beneath. He had no intention of playing by anyone else's rules now. The courtroom buzzed with an undercurrent of tension, the events from the day before still fresh in everyone's minds. The footage of Grayson's assault on Amir had rocked the room to its core, and the prosecution was scrambling. But Terrence had come prepared. He wasn't just going to sit quietly in the back anymore. His presence would be felt. As he walked toward the front of the room, the eyes of the courtroom followed him. The murmurs died down, and for a moment, it felt as if the world had gone quiet. Terrence approached the judge, a firm resolve in his step. He reached into his coat pocket and produced the flash drive, holding it out to the bailiff. "This contains crucial evidence. I request to be heard as a witness." Judge Perkins, who had been leaning over papers at the bench, looked up, his expression neutral but wary. "Mr. Daniels?" he asked, his voice cautious. The name seemed to register with a few in the room, though most weren't sure why. Grayson's face went pale. He'd heard that name before from military records. Terrence Daniels, the Phantom, they'd called him. A commander known for operating in the shadows, striking with surgical precision, disappearing without a trace, and leaving nothing but wreckage in his wake. Terrence stood tall, his gaze unwavering. "I request to be heard as a witness," he repeated, his voice calm but filled with an authority that could not be ignored. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The judge paused, then nodded. "Proceed." Grayson's shoulders stiffened. He had been expecting a battle, but nothing like this. He could feel the weight of his past decisions closing in on him, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. He glanced at Nolan, who was now visibly sweating, but neither of them spoke. Terrence's eyes locked onto Grayson's, and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Terrence turned to the bailiff, who had already begun inserting the flash drive into the courtroom's AV system. The screen flickered to life and the first video played. It was the footage from the holding cell, showing Grayson roughly shaving Amir's head, a cruel mockery of the boy's pride. Amir's voice was barely audible, but in the video, his quiet plea for mercy could be heard. "My mom used to braid it. Please don't." Terrence clenched his fists at his sides, fighting the urge to move toward Grayson and make him feel the weight of every second that Amir had endured. But he held his ground, knowing this moment was bigger than his rage. The courtroom erupted into gasps and murmurs. Some jurors covered their mouths in shock, while others sat motionless, unable to look away. The judge's face twisted in disgust as he watched the footage, and for the first time since the trial had begun, he seemed to lose his composure. His hands slammed down on the gavel. "Order!" But the video wasn't over. The second clip began to play, bodycam footage, clearly taken from Grayson's camera, though he had never submitted it as evidence. The recording showed Amir being shoved by another student, the very incident that had led to his arrest. Grayson's earlier claim of Amir's aggression fell apart as the video revealed the truth. Amir had simply raised his hands in self-defense. Grayson's face went ashen, his earlier smugness evaporating. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting around the room, hoping to find a way out. But it was too late. The truth had been exposed. Terence turned to the judge, his voice calm but cutting. You punished my son for being proud of who he is. You humiliated him for something you didn't understand. And now you're going to answer for it. Grayson's arrogance melted away, leaving behind only shame. His eyes welled with tears as he stared at the floor, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The courtroom, once filled with doubt and uncertainty, now seemed to settle into a strange silence, as if waiting for the final judgment. But Terence wasn't finished. He turned to the judge, his gaze unwavering. There's more, he said. And this is where it gets interesting. The judge looked at him, his expression unreadable. What do you mean, Mr. Daniels? Terence took a deep breath, knowing the next step would change everything. The timestamps on these videos don't match the court records, he said quietly. Grayson wasn't acting alone. The words hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. The judge's eyes widened, and the murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Grayson's face paled even further. The real story is deeper than a single officer, Terence continued. Someone higher up has been covering up the abuse. They've been manipulating the evidence, trying to erase the truth. I know how this works. This isn't just a bad cop. This is a systemic problem. The tension in the courtroom escalated. People were shifting in their seats, whispering in disbelief. Grayson's hands trembled as he tried to hold himself together. But it was clear now that the entire case was about to unravel. The judge's voice was low and steady, though it carried a note of authority. We're moving to federal review, he said, slamming the gavel down. Terence stood still, his eyes fixed on Grayson. This wasn't just about his son anymore. This was about everyone who had been hurt by this corrupt system. And he wasn't going to stop until the truth was laid bare for all to see. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The courtroom was charged with an electric tension, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Terence Daniels stood before the judge, his commanding presence filling the space. His black uniform, freshly pressed, spoke of his long years of service, of battles fought both overseas and within the quiet corners of government bureaucracy. His face, rugged and hard from years of discipline, remained calm, his eyes narrowing with purpose. Today was not about the soldiers he commanded, nor the dangerous missions he had survived. It was about his son, Amir. Behind him, Amir sat rigidly in the chair, his eyes darting nervously between the judge, his father, and the audience that had gathered. The boy had not yet spoken a word since the start of the trial. His head, still freshly shaved, was a painful reminder of what had been done to him. It was a wound that ran deeper than the skin. He had once worn his hair with pride, his mother's hands weaving intricate braids that told stories of strength, love, and family. But now it was all gone, reduced to nothing but a bald scalp, a symbol of humiliation. But Amir wasn't crying anymore. He had cried when they handcuffed him, when they shaved his hair, when they put him in that cold holding cell. But now, sitting next to his father, there was nothing but a simmering quiet. No tears, no anger, just a quiet resignation and an unspoken need for justice. His fingers, though clenched, trembled slightly as they rested on his lap. The tension was palpable, the courtroom on the edge of something huge. Grayson, standing stiffly by the bench, was sweating. His previously smug expression had faded into something almost childlike, the fear in his eyes evident to all. He had thought he was untouchable, that no one would stand against him. But now, as he looked across at Terence Daniels, he was beginning to understand that everything was about to change. Terence's voice broke the silence, calm yet cutting. There's one detail left, he said, looking directly at Judge Perkins, his voice low but resonating with power. His eyes flicked toward the back of the room, where a man had been sitting quietly throughout the trial, his presence almost unnoticeable among the crowd. There's something I couldn't say until now, Terence continued, his eyes never leaving the judge. The agent who uncovered the disciplinary overrides, he's standing in this courtroom. He gestured toward the back row with a sharp flick of his hand. A hushed murmur spread through the courtroom as the man stood, his movements deliberate, his plain clothes making him look almost ordinary, except for the badge he now flashed for all to see. "Internal affairs," the man announced quietly, his voice strong but steady, clearly accustomed to speaking in moments of great tension. The room exploded into chaos. Grayson's face drained of color as his eyes locked onto the agent's badge. He stammered, his legs suddenly feeling as if they couldn't hold his weight. The arrogance that had defined him for so long crumbled away, leaving behind a terrified man who had just realized he was no longer in control. I didn't know it would go this far," Grayson mumbled, his voice cracking. "I thought it was just scare tactics." His voice trembled with the weight of his own words, the lie unraveling before him. Amir's hands tightened in his lap, the fingernails digging into his skin. He had heard whispers, hints of what his father had done in the past, but nothing had ever prepared him for this moment. The truth was now spilling out into the open, and Amir felt both a sense of relief and dread. His father was here, standing tall, bringing justice not just for him, but for everyone who had been hurt by people like Grayson. The agent, who had been quietly observing from the back of the room, moved toward the front. His gaze was unwavering, his every step a symbol of authority and resolve. He was not there for personal glory. He was there because he believed in right and wrong. He had infiltrated the network that Grayson had been a part of, uncovering years of abuse and manipulation. This was the moment everything would change. This was the turning point. "Grayson," Terrence said, his voice suddenly much colder. "You may have thought you were above it all, but today you answer for your actions. Not just for what you did to my son, but for all the others like him that you've tormented. You thought you could get away with this, but you were wrong." The air in the courtroom was thick, the eyes of everyone fixed on Grayson. The man who had once been untouchable was now cornered, his fate sealed. His knees buckled slightly, and he reached for the railing to steady himself. His face was a mask of disbelief. But Terrence wasn't finished yet. Terrence pulled a flash drive from his coat pocket and handed it to the bailiff, his eyes never leaving Grayson. "This contains footage from the holding cell before Amir's court appearance. It was quietly retrieved by someone who believed in right and wrong more than rank," he said, his words echoing in the silence. The bailiff plugged the flash drive into the courtroom's monitor, and the screen flickered to life. The entire room fell silent as the footage played. It was clear, undeniable. The video showed Grayson, his face twisted with contempt, as he mocked Amir in the holding cell. The footage caught him shaving Amir's head, the sound of the clippers buzzing in the quiet room. Amir was silent, his face showing only a quiet dignity as he looked down at the floor, trying to hide his pain. The clip continued, showing Grayson's mocking words. "My mom used to braid it. Please don't." Grayson's voice was harsh, a sound that made the courtroom wince. Grayson's face was now ashen. His hands trembled, his earlier bravado gone, replaced with the realization that everything he had done was now in the light. He had thought he was untouchable, that his position, his authority, would shield him from the consequences of his actions. But now the entire world could see what he had done. The second clip played. It was from a body cam showing Amir in the school hallway. The footage caught the moment when another student had shoved Amir, who simply raised his hands in defense, not escalating the situation, only trying to protect himself. The context was now clear. The entire trial, the charge against Amir, had been based on a lie. The judge slammed his gavel down with a force that shook the room. "I am ordering an immediate recess," he announced, his voice sharp with fury. "This court will not continue until these new revelations are fully investigated." Grayson was escorted from the courtroom, but not in handcuffs, not yet. The weight of his actions was still sinking in. Nolan, the assistant district attorney, sat frozen at his table, his face a mask of disbelief. He had never expected this to happen, never imagined that his actions, his manipulations, would lead to this point. As Grayson was led away, the courtroom buzzed with conversation. Reporters scrambled to take notes, their pens moving furiously as the truth unfolded before them. The cameras clicked, capturing every moment. But none of them mattered more than the moment that was happening between Terence and Amir. Terence walked over to his son, kneeling beside him, placing a firm but gentle hand on his shoulder. "You did nothing wrong, Amir," he said quietly, his voice low but filled with conviction. "You never deserved any of this." Amir looked up at his father, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and confusion. For 3 long years, he had believed his father was dead. He had believed his life was a series of lonely moments, moments where he fought battles he couldn't win. But now, in this moment, he had his father back. And for the first time in a long while, Amir felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. But as he sat there, his fingers trembling slightly in his lap, Amir asked something that made his father pause. "Can I have a mirror?" Amir whispered, his voice barely audible. "I want to see who I am." Terence didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, polished mirror, handing it to Amir. The boy took it carefully, his fingers grazing the smooth surface. He looked at his reflection, his face still raw, still haunted by what had happened. But as he gazed at himself, something shifted in his eyes. He didn't see just the boy who had been humiliated, who had been wronged by people in power. He saw the boy who had fought through it all, who had survived. For the first time, Amir smiled. "I'm me," he said softly. Terence's heart swelled with pride. His son was no longer the scared boy he had once been. He was someone stronger, someone unbroken. "Yeah," Terence said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are." Amir Daniels sat on the school steps, the warmth of the spring sun kissing his skin, but it couldn't reach the cold weight that still lingered in his chest. His hair, once shaved close to his scalp in the most demeaning way imaginable, was slowly starting to grow back. It wasn't much yet, just a few short, uneven strands, but they were his. His own hair, his own identity returning to him piece by piece. He felt the heat on his shoulders, but his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't thinking about the kids who walked past him, some of them nodding, others offering small, hesitant fist bumps. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, on something far beyond the quiet town, something that felt unreachable despite its proximity. Beside him, Terence sat, his father's large frame casting a shadow over Amir as he flipped through a letter with the stiff, calculated precision of someone accustomed to reading orders. Terence Daniels, a man who had been missing in action for 3 years, was now sitting next to him, not in a military uniform, but in civilian clothes, a slight creasing of wear along the sleeves showing the remnants of a soldier who could never fully shake off his past. The letter he read wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the end of an era for him. His final clearance papers had come through, allowing him to officially return home, a place he hadn't stepped foot in since before the chaos of his covert military operations had pulled him away. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting a golden light over the town that had seen so much injustice, so much pain, and now, finally, a hint of change. The same town where his son had been wrongfully humiliated in court. The same town where the corrupt officer, Grayson, and his accomplice, Nolan, had thought they could get away with tormenting a young boy without consequence. They were gone now, their names stripped from the school's records, replaced by a new oversight board meant to ensure that justice, at least in this small corner of the world, would be served more fairly. Judge Perkins had even announced a juvenile justice reform initiative in Amir's name, a step toward redemption that the community had desperately needed. They had called it the Daniels Reform, a symbol of the change that Amir had unknowingly sparked. But Amir wasn't interested in the headlines, the speeches, or the accolades. He didn't want to be a symbol. He just wanted peace. He didn't care about the murmurs of the kids passing by, some of whom paused long enough to give him a nod or a silent acknowledgement. A few brave ones even approached him and offered fist bumps. Carter, one of the bullies who had tormented him, was among them, his usual swagger replaced by a strange hesitancy. He stopped in front of Amir, looking down at the boy who had once been an easy target. His expression was softer now, lacking the usual arrogance. "Sorry, man," Carter began, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. "I didn't know." Amir didn't respond. He didn't need to. He stood up, his body taller now, his posture straighter, but not because of the apology. It was something else entirely. He was taller because the weight was gone. The burden of the last few weeks, the taunts, the humiliation had been lifted. It wasn't just about his hair, or even about the injustice that had been done to him. It was about the support he'd received, the strength that his father had given him when he thought he had been alone. And it was about something else, something Amir didn't fully understand yet, his place in this world. For the first time, he wasn't just the victim of a cruel system. He was the catalyst for change. That realization, deep down in his chest, gave him more power than any apology ever could. Terence stood up beside him, his broad hand landing gently on Amir's shoulder. "You ready?" he asked, his voice calm, steady, always the leader, always the soldier. But there was something else in his voice, a softness that Amir had never heard before. It was the sound of a father, a protector, someone who had finally come home. Amir nodded, a slow, deliberate movement that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. He didn't have to look at his father to know what came next. The years of separation, of pain, of confusion, all of it was about to be put behind them. Together, they turned away from the school steps and began walking down the quiet street, toward the future. It wasn't a clear future, not yet. There would be challenges ahead, there always were. But for the first time in years, the weight of those challenges felt light. Together they walked, unshaken, unbroken. The world ahead of them was full of uncertainties, but it no longer mattered. They were ready for it. The town, though, had changed in ways Amir hadn't expected. He thought the people would remember him as the boy who had been humiliated, the boy whose head had been shaved in front of everyone. But that wasn't how it turned out. People looked at him differently now, not with pity or sympathy, but with respect. It was as if the whole town had been waiting for something that could ignite a spark of change. And Amir, in his quiet way, had given it to them. The world was different now, and it was only because he had refused to bow under the weight of the injustice that had been thrown at him. As Amir and Terence walked through the streets, the evening light stretching long across the pavement, they passed the same places Amir had walked before, the ones where the bullies had made their mark on his life. He no longer flinched at the sight of them. He didn't even look back. The past was behind him, and there was nothing left to hold him there. His thoughts shifted to the changes that had come with the reform, Judge Perkins's initiative, the oversight board, the federal investigation that had exposed the corruption running deep within the system. Those changes were important. They were necessary. But to Amir, they weren't the point. The point was that he had fought for himself and for every other kid who had ever felt powerless. The fight had been long, but it was over. For now, anyway. The sound of footsteps approaching from behind pulled Amir from his thoughts. He turned to see Carter again, the boy who had once made his life miserable. But this time, the look in Carter's eyes was different. The confidence was gone, replaced by something quieter, more thoughtful. Carter didn't stop to apologize again, but there was a shift in the air, a silent acknowledgement that things had changed. Amir nodded slightly as they passed. He didn't need to say anything else. The change had already been made. The truth had been exposed, and that was enough. As they reached the end of the street, Amir glanced up at his father. There was a quiet pride in Terence's eyes. Amir had always looked up to him, but now he realized it wasn't just because of the man's military service or his reputation as a leader. It was because Terence had always known that true strength wasn't about fighting battles. It was about standing firm no matter what and doing the right thing, even when the world told you to be quiet. "Let's go home," Terence said, his voice thick with emotion. Amir nodded again. They didn't need to say anything more. Home wasn't just a place. It was where they both had finally found peace, together. As they walked, the last remnants of sunlight cast long shadows across the town, stretching out before them, and Amir knew, deep in his heart, that this was the beginning of something new, something better, and for the first time he believed it. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional, created to highlight issues of racial injustice and abuse of power. Its purpose is to raise awareness, promote empathy, and encourage meaningful discussions about justice, equality, and accountability in law enforcement.